I've been reading your book with great interest. I have not finished it. There's what's happened is I've been reading your book is I get I start with the Old Norse section and I'm like, oh man, this is such a good story and I haven't seen this in so long. And then I go back and I have to read that, right? And then I come back like because you bring up, and I want to get right into this in just a moment. You bring up some amazing like deep cuts that a lot of people don't know about. And I think that you make a really interesting series of points about hell. So why don't we get into it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. And I think, the random deep cuts are that's my passion, right? The obscure stuff that people don't care about, but maybe should, right? You got to do that
Yeah,
when Apocrypha is your main thing.
yeah. Well, and I'll tell you too, I think a lot of my audience is very much of a similar mind because a lot of the folks that tune into my channel for these interviews and things like that, they have read a lot of, the sort of canon of Old Norse and they're interested in branching out and seeing other things. Um, and I'd really like to talk to you, especially about that one Thaltor and about Nitherstigning saga. So, folks, this is Dr. Stephen Hopkins, Assistant Professor of Old English and Old Norse at the University of Virginia. Also, has quite a background in the Celtic languages I found. It's a little bit of a blind spot for me, so it's been interesting to see some of that material too. Recent author of the new book, Translating Hell, which is about, well, you tell us what it's about.
Okay. So translating hell is basically I'm looking at the reception and transformation of Apocrypha about hell as they travel around the North Sea, right? The project kind of started when, as part of early grad school reading, I was reading through Dante's Divine Comedy, and I thought, like, how do we get from the handful of references to hell in the New Testament? Because there's only a half a dozen verses that actually explicitly talk about it, and they don't give a whole lot of detail. So how do we get from the few references that are there to like this schematic, complex, rich, layered version of hell with all this symbolism in it, right? What happened in the middle? So that was sort of where I started with the dissertation, and I wanted to figure out like what allowed people to like sort of elaborate upon the idea of hell. And the answer that I sort of landed on was Apocrypha, right? They're non-canonical scriptures, so they look and sound like scripture, but they weren't universally regarded as scripture. And I argue that this sort of liminal status in terms of like textual authority, right, allowed some people to revere them, right? A lot of people read Apocrypha as spiritually edifying and maybe even scripture adjacent. But it also allowed people to revise them kind of consequence free since they weren't, they would never do that with the canonical texts, but they could elaborate or they could like bring in maybe some other cool lore that they'd read in a French manuscript or something and sort of graft these things together. And so Apocrypha have a habit of transforming in even in recopying, but also in sort of growing and accreting, right? Slowly over the centuries. And so that's what I'm looking at is sort of what happens when these hell texts, specifically the Gospel of Nicodemus and the Vision of St. Paul, get translated from Latin into Old English, Old Norse, Middle Welsh, Old Irish as they travel around the sort of North Sea.
I was about to say, so an example of the Apocrypha would be for the Gospel of Nicodemus. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because people may not be familiar with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I grew up thinking that there were four gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. I hadn't heard about Apocrypha until late in undergrad when I was taking a Beowulf seminar. And my professor said, "Oh, well, if you're interested in hell," and I was like kind of writing about the Grindel's Mere, where the fire is on the flood, where there's fire on top of the water. And he was like, "Well, some people have compared that to the Gospel of Nicodemus." And I was like, "The Gospel of what now?" So the Gospel of Nicodemus is this fifth gospel that seems to be. It was written fairly early. We have we have it fully by the fifth century, but basically it's a gospel that synthesizes the crucifixion accounts from the other canonical gospels and basically gives another version of the trial and crucifixion of Christ before Pilate. Its earliest recensions are actually known as the Acta Pilati, the Acts of Pilate, because it seems to have started out as a document that sort of depending on how it gets written, exonerates Pilate, sort of lets the Romans off the hook, which seems like the sort of thing you might want to do if you are a Roman Catholic and St. Peter's Basilica is important to you, right? You have this problem of like, well, didn't you guys kill Jesus? Like, how did that happen? So this apocryphal text, one theory as to why it was composed in the first place is to sort of exonerate Rome symbolically, right? So that this is not a problem. But yeah, that's the first half of the text is the Pilate trial and crucifixion. But then after that, the second half, which does seem to have been composed separately, and then these things were brought together in the fifth century, is the descent into hell. And that's the one where Jesus basically goes down into hell after the crucifixion on Good Friday, and he liberates the prophets and patriarchs from the Hebrew Bible, or what medieval Christians would have thought of as their Old Testament. You know, people like Adam and Eve and all the prophets and Abraham, right? And leads them up out of hell in time for the resurrection on Sunday.
Yeah.
So.
And remarkably, there is an Old Norse translation of this text.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That was one reason why I picked that text and the Vision of St. Paul in particular, is those are numerically, like in terms of manuscript survival, they're some of the most well-attested medieval texts that we have, period. There's over 450 copies of the Gospel of Nicodemus in Latin alone that survive today.
I
So it's a
was
test about any vernacular language.
I was really stunned I didn't realize how popular it was. I mean, I knew it
Mhm.
was out there and floating around. I didn't realize how popular it was. I also didn't realize something you said kind of as an aside, but it stunned me a little bit that there's an early modern text of it. And I'm like, so like a Lutheran copied this? That's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about. Like, yeah, because that's actually I'm actually writing a paper. Hopefully your viewers aren't my editors, but it's due
Unlikely.
it's fashionably late. But I've got a paper talking about the reception of scripture um, in Apocrypha, especially in Iceland. And this is like one of the weird things, one of the quirky things about Icelandic history is that Apocrypha in general seem to become very volatile, controversial during the Reformation, right? They're wildly popular before the Reformation, all throughout the Middle Ages. And then once textual scholarship sort of comes to the fore as some of the ammunition in these arguments over, whose Bible is best, who understands Scripture best, who understands the apostolic tradition, right? You can't understand those things that claim primacy to all that unless you have the best version of the tradition, which means the best manuscripts and the best Bible, right? And
You're
so,
Erasmus kind of guys. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, 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 exactly. And so, yeah, Erasmus and those guys sort of well, they wind up villainizing Apocrypha as sort of like popish nonsense, right? um, Medieval superstition that has accrued to the Bible, and Protestants are above that. And then some Catholics become suspicious of their own apocryphal texts for the same reason, as sort of a counter-Reformation move. So anyway, all to say, post 1500, apocrypha start to decline. They don't totally, and they don't go away. In fact, some people still are really into them today, right? But they definitely get viewed with some skepticism after that. Not in Iceland. In Iceland, because the Lutheran Church is well, coming later, right? They don't produce their own full translation of the New Testament, right, until like 1550 or something like that. It's kind of like the Black Death, where it arrives surprisingly late, right?
1540 is older Gulfskalkson's New Testament.
Oh, sorry, 1540.
And
Yeah.
and I think Guthbrand's Biblia, the complete one, is 1584.
Okay. Yeah.
That
Yeah. Yeah. So,
I think
so
it's
it is like it is. I think that they're sort of imitating Luther's Bible, right, being in the vernacular, and they want their own too. So yeah. So that all happens a bit late, but at the same time, they are. Lutheranism is connecting them to the continent and to these like continental lanes of transmission, cultural transmission, and part of that is just texts, right?
mm,
And so on the one hand, they're importing Lutheranism, and on the other hand, somebody is also importing more Apocrypha
mm.
because we have like the Testament of Solomon that shows up as super rare Apocryphon that is not known in the West in general. Suddenly just crops up in an Icelandic manuscript circa 1500. And that's what I'm trying to figure out is like, where the heck did they get? It's this cool story about King Solomon using a magic ring to summon demons and help him build the temple. Uh, um,
Rock and roll. Is it in Icelandic translation or is it in Latin?
yeah, yeah, it's in Icelandic.
Never read
Yep.
that. It's awesome.
It's yeah, yeah, it's Mariana Overgaard's 1962 Arnamagnian edition of the History of the Holy Rood Tree, and it
Okay.
is just interpolated into that legend. And it has I've been studying the Holy Rood legend for a long time now, and I've never seen a version that just also casually says, "By the way, Solomon used flying demons to haul stones up for the temple." I'm like,
It's rock and roll. I mean, that's a
very metal.
yeah, right. I know. This is like a Megadeth album cover, like damn.
Yeah,
So the Gospel of Nicodemus is translated into Old Norse as Niðurstigningar saga.
fun to say.
It is kind of fun to say. And what can you tell us about that translation and the cultural context that produced it? And there's a certain amount of, I mean, there's so many different threads we can kind of follow here, but you talk quite a bit about the syncretism, the unique Icelandic syncretism
Mhm,
of pre-Christian and Christian traditions. And I think you make a really interesting implicit and explicit comparison of Niðurstigningar saga to Völuspá.
mhm.
So if you could talk a little bit about that, I'd be happy.
Yeah, sure. I'm trying to think which is the best one to start with. Why don't we start with Niðurstigningar saga and then go backwards to Völuspá as to like what might be going on there.
All right.
So, and this is not completely uncontroversial, right? Because I think anytime you talk about the history of Völuspá in particular, you're just asking for it's sort of like trying to date Beowulf, right? You are kicking a
All right.
landmine
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
gleefully.
But I mean, like, you don't say anything crazy, and I happen to agree with you. So,
Okay, great. People will let us know in the chat if they hate it, or in book reviews, maybe even better.
or YouTube comments.
Yeah, that's it. Um, Anyway, yeah, so Niðurstigningar saga, right, which like literally means the descent saga, right? As in the saga of the descent of Christ into hell. Our earliest manuscript copy of it is circa 1200. I think there's pretty good evidence. Philologists smarter than me have argued that it probably goes back another generation of copying before that copy, but not much more. But anyway, it's the Old Norse translation of the Latin version of the Gospel of Nicodemus, just the back half. I mentioned that, the Acts of Pilate,
Hmm.
A and B, right, were sort of two separate texts. One interesting thing, I think, one telling thing that happens over the course of the mission of that text in the Middle Ages is that the A version becomes a lot less popular. People kind of don't really care for yet another retelling of the trial of Christ. And so there's the long Latin version of it that you'll find in some manuscripts, but then there's the much more popular Hell Redaction, is what it's called in scholarship, which is a great name, right? That's basically just the B text, and so that's what you get in Niðurstigningar Saga is just the B text. It basically starts and says, one day, Christ was crucified and went down to hell. So it picks up right at the action. Actually, it opens with the Hebrew Bible prophets and patriarchs sort of in darkness and gloom, and they see a great light pierce the darkness, and they all sort of have a conversation. Adam is like, "Who is that? What is this? What's going on?" And then you get this sort of train of prophets who pop up, like Isaiah, and he says the verse, he says the line that like they would say in the Easter liturgy when they are saying, oh, the people who have dwelt in darkness see a great light, right? And so it's a sort of way of in having the prophets pop up and say their little iconic line, right? The text is basically sort of saying like, here's a chain of extra literal readings of these Hebrew scriptures, right? Here's the bit from Isaiah that we are interpreting as a prophecy that was really about Jesus, even if Isaiah didn't realize that at the time. Um, right? The thinking about the timing and all of this actually it gets really confusing the more you think about it. But anyway, that's what they're doing is they're providing a model of typological readings, right? I guess I should probably tell people typology um, in Christian hermeneutics, right? Interpretation is the idea that um, things that happened in the Old Testament foreshadowed things that would be fulfilled in the New Testament, right? Usually through Christ's life. So, the term itself actually comes from the Greek word tupos, which Paul uses in First Corinthians when he says that Moses and the Israelites passing through the Red Sea was a type for Christian baptism. That they sort of set the pattern in this prophetic way, and that it was fulfilled, right? They pass through the water and they're all saved, right? Just like Christians go through the water and they're all saved from the slavery of sin or whatever. So anyway, Gospel of Nicodemus, another Stigninger saga opens with these prophets who come out and they say their little prophecies about how, that's Jesus. I told you he was going to come. He's going to come and save us. And he does. In the Old Norse version of it, one of the things I was really struck by the first time I read it was for a few sentences, it seemed like, yeah, okay, this is a literal, straightforward translation, probably nothing too exciting going on here. And then as soon as Satan is mentioned for the first time, he is called the High Troll of Helheim or the High Prince of Helheim. And I was like, wait, what? Um, that's
Do
just casually dropped there in the like second sentence.
do any of the manuscripts include the guitar tabs?
Nooms, I don't know when Nooms first appear in Icelandic manuscripts, if ever, so I don't know. Um, but that part is probably like in drop D or drop C or something. Um, but anyway, so that happens right away, and then the text kind of goes on and just kind of follows a literal translation of the Latin version. Nothing too exciting until you get to the part where in the Latin, Satan hears about the crucifixion happening. And so they sort of report it in the third person about this thing that's happening on Earth, and and then there's a debate between Satan, death, and hell. This personified characters, where they're like debating whether it was a bad idea or not to have crucified this guy because he may or may not be the son of God. And Satan is an idiot, and he's like, no, he can't be the son of God because he was crying in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's how I know he's a human and he's a coward. Um, and
Yeah,
so, anyway,
this whole thing about Satan thinking Jesus is just a man, right? And it kind of like I was thinking about that because it seemed to be sort of a persistent like motif.
yeah.
And I was kind of thinking about like in the Gospel of Mark, which I'm reasonably familiar with the Gospels because I'm really into Gothic, and so
Oh, yeah, that's all you have to read.
like what can I read? But the demons are always like it's sort of noticeable that they recognize that Christ is who he is, and he's like, don't tell anybody or something, right?
Right.
Like so I'm like, why doesn't Satan know and why wouldn't he know? You know?
Yeah, it's actually sort of reenacting some ecumenical councils,
Oh,
reenacting some of the debates that were happening, especially between the Eastern Church and the Western Church over the or Arianism, I mean, basically over whether Christ was just a man or how the fusion of, being the God man, right? We're starting to get into like some really deep Anselmian type of theology with this, right? But
yeah.
it is sort of reenacting that
I've,
and honestly, when you think about it, like if you're going to take your opponents in a theological argument and assign their opinion to Satan, and then show how stupid Satan is, that's a super own,
it's a
right?
flex. It's a flex.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so that is why, and also there's this trope about Satan, the beguiler, who beguiled Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, is the one who ultimately is going to be beguiled by Christ. And so like there's this the concern for symmetry between the whole cosmic
Yeah.
Heilsgeschichte, the history of salvation. There needs to be perfect symmetry between all these events, right? So if Satan tricked us in the beginning, he's gonna get tricked at this pivotal moment in history. But yeah, anyway, so when he hears about it in Old Norse, though, he doesn't just talk about it. The text says that he shapeshifts into the Midgard serpent and flies to Jerusalem to devour Christ off the cross, um, which obviously does not happen in any other version of this text in any other language ever, period.
I was sort of floored by this.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, and then he goes to bite the cross and it falls down on him and it says that it traps him like a fish on a hook or a mouse in a mouse trap or an Arctic fox in a snare, which is like the most Icelandic metaphor you could come up with, right?
it's always kind of fun when it actually gets really Icelandic. I had heard about this, like just the term Niðurstigningarsaga had bounced around here and there, and I see some because it is a fairly old text, right? So I sometimes see like, oh, this archaic form is attested there, and I'm like, whatever, it's just more homiletic literature. But apparently, this is actually really rad.
Yeah, yeah, that's the thing is like people often assume that like Apocrypha, like, it's already just more Sunday school stories.
Yeah,
I've read it in Latin. Why would I bother to read it again in a harder, deader language, right? This is what you're missing out on. This is what my book is trying to, deliver you to. Um, but yeah, so so what's especially like amazing to me about that particular moment with the fish hook slash Arctic fox what's the word? What's the Old Norse word? Treketi for like a wooden cat is the name for a mousetrap, right? Which I also find charming in its own way. But Satan gets trapped, right? He gets tricked in this way. And in that moment, the saga writer has basically brought together three separate strands and woven them together in like a single sentence quite seamlessly, I think, right? There's three levels of logic at least going on there. First, you get Satan caught like a fish on a fish hook, which is an image, it's a phrase borrowed straight from a homily by John Chrysostom, where he says that Christ was, he's like a fisherman, which isn't surprising given all the time he spends on fishing boats in the Gospels, right?
Mhm.
And that he catches the on the flesh or the hook of his divinity, he catches Satan, right?
Mhm.
And so again, coming back to this thing about how Satan doesn't understand the true nature of Christ as a God man, that's why the crucifixion works, right? That's how it is salvific. And so anyway, that's coming from John Chrysostom. And it's sort of a homiletic commonplace that gets recycled later on. But that's one strand. The other strand is we get this we get the Midgard serpent being caught on a fishhook and defeated because of that, right? Which to me screams Humskvida, right? Thor's fishing trip. He's the other guy who caught the Midgard serpent famously, and may or may not. Well, in one version he kills him, in another version, most versions, the giant Humir cuts the line and lets him go, and so they'll have their final confrontation at Ragnarok, right? That's two strands. What's the third strand? Fish on a fishhook. Oh, I lost my train of thought.
Mousetrap, Arctic Fox. Um, I mean, both of those strands are compelling, right?
Yeah, right. And so like, but this, you get this weird moment where it's like, okay, Christ literally out Thors Thor,
Hmm.
right? They're using, it's staggering to me that they're using Norse mythology, even obliquely like this, to basically typologically explain something as central as the crucifixion, right? It's like the central fact of this religion.
Yeah, I mean, it brings you back to which cross is that? Is that the Gosforth cross,
Yep.
right? Which you also, I mean, you adduced that in your discussion of this, but and just remarkable. I mean, that you cannot help but think that that's an intentional echo. I mean,
Right.
you have the excuse always, of course, yeah, I will make you fishers of men. Jesus is a fisherman, etc. Right? But like, it's too perfect. Yeah, especially
Right.
especially something introduced.
Mhm. Yeah, and so like to take that moment and sort of, there's nothing in the Latin that would suggest that you should bring in any other body of mythology or whatever in relation to this discussion, right? And so that's like clearly like a very clever move by some translator, some redactor at some point to bring that in. And the only purpose that I can think of to do that is to appeal to an audience that knows Norse mythology well enough that this reference would awe them, right? That they would see that like Christ finishes the job that Thor could not do, right? Because even in the end, spoilers, hopefully people know this, but Thor and the Midgard serpent kill each other, right? He doesn't get to triumph over the Midgard serpent, but Jesus does, right?
And all of this ties, I mean, just to kind of bring it back to something we mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, ties back to Voluspa a little bit because you see some sort of like a much earlier version of the same kind of syncretism, but from the other way there, right?
Yeah, it's a really vexed question in the field, right? As you know, the question of, we have all these old texts, we have the Poetic Edda. I mean, you have your translation of them, right? You've worked with them intimately. Um, their reception history is a real puzzle. We have these texts that had to have written, like we know the technology of writing is a Christian importation mostly, right? I mean, they had runes before that, but as far as we know, there's not like a whole codex that is
Right,
runic length, right? So
right,
book length writing is a monastic thing mostly, at least originally. And
right.
so how is it that we have all these written texts that linguistically we can argue they're much older, and some of us believe in that, and other people, are linguistically agnostic. Um,
And then
and
there's
so
lots of people at universities in Germany that say that we're idiots for thinking that. So like, it's kind of how it goes.
yeah. Yeah, and so that's it's a very vexed question of sort of what if the texts really are, if the poems are centuries older, right? Which linguistically, I think you can make and metrically, especially like Chris Sapp's
Yeah,
recent
exactly.
book, I think did a great job of demonstrating that, right? And of course, as a student of Rob Folk, I'm also inclined to believe the metricists.
Those are two great name drops.
But yeah, I mean, so that's just sort of where my loyalties are. Although I am not a metrist myself, right? Rob tried very hard, and we moved on. He let me do my weird apocrypha thing instead. Um, but yeah, you, if the texts really are as old as we think they are, the poems, I should say, rather than the texts, then how is it that we have written versions from so much later, especially after the conversion period, especially when you have other peoples around the North Sea who converted, who didn't keep a shred of their mythologies, right? In
Mhm.
England, I mean, we got nothing. We have the days of the week, and from that we can deduce that they must have known something about Woden and Thor and Frigg. Am I forgetting one?
Tier, tier.
Okay,
Yeah.
right, Tuesday, right. Yeah, yeah. I was like, I feel like I'm started the wrong part of the week. Anyway, yeah. So we have four very passing references to them. Um, we don't, I mean, it seems like for whatever reason, when the English converted, they had to leave all of that stuff behind, or maybe, I mean, I'm sure you could phrase it differently. Maybe there was an active campaign to suppress it. I think the metrical charms gives us glances at like maybe some rural traditions. This is sort of what my Old English chapter is at least partially thinking about, right? Sort of out there in the heath, in the countryside, it seems like there were survivals or whatever, or pockets or something. At least maybe it's just folklore tradition. But anyway, if that's representative, and indeed we don't have Old Saxon, we don't have much in Old Saxon either. We don't have much in Gothic, like references to pre-Christian religion, right? Which makes sense because it's just the New Testament. Um, but the question in my mind is why were the Icelanders slash Norwegians so special? Why did they get to keep their mythology? I hesitate to say intact, but why do they get to keep so much of it, right? Maybe
Yeah.
the intact is an illusion created by people after 1200, right? Maybe it was pre-Christian. That's where things get really contentious, I think. But whatever it is, there's so much more of it than there is in Old English or Old Saxon or whatever other pre-Christian. The only other group in this whole region that gets to keep anything, it seems, are the Irish.
Mhm.
And maybe there's something to say about that connection, right? But yeah, it's all very speculative because we're talking about a centuries wide gap between when these texts might have been composed orally versus when they were written down, and trying to look at a text like Volaspal and figure out, okay, so the if you make like a stanza by stanza summary of the plot of Volaspal, its overall program is kind of reminds you of the Bible, right? Of the Christian world history. There's a creation with a sort of golden age, and then there's like a fall of sorts around stanza seven, right? Or eight when Gulveig gets brought in and tortured. Maybe that's gold and greed corrupting society or whatever, right? And then there's the fall, and like the sky is blended, and Loki shows up out of nowhere. And then we get sort of a steady march through like phases, like miserable phases of increasingly horrible history, right? Until we get to Ragnarok, and there's going to be a final battle, and the whole old order is going to pass away. There's going to be a series of cataclysms that are evocative of the Christian Sibylline doomsday prophecies and the 15 signs of judgment, which is another apocryphal text. And then everything goes up in flames. And then in one version, right, in the Hauksbook version, we get the happy ending. The Inriki comes down, right? Whoever that is, probably Jesus, right? Um, and everything is good again, and there's a new creation. So like when you look at that plot skeleton, it's hard to look at that and say, yeah, that's just a coincidence that it mirrors the whole Christian world salvation history blow for
Yeah.
blow, right? Like that's the Augustinian 7 days of creation plot.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to look at Volaspal and not think that the author somehow has encountered some version of the Christian story. What's interesting, I think, well, there's a lot of things interesting about your take on this. Part of it is your particular view and very clear way of talking about the syncretism involved, which I want to hear some more about. But I also wanted to say, bringing in all the Apocrypha, because I've read Revelation,
Mhm.
and you read Revelation and you read Volaspal, and there's not that much similarity between Revelation as a book and Voluspa. Because one thing Revelation keeps doing is basically, have, this is your fault. This is your
Yeah.
fault. This is
It's a
your
bunch of
fault.
angry emails, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's not quite so true of some of the apocryphal literature.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, Voluspel and the its version of Ragnarok and things like that is often compared to another Old Norse text, Merlinuspal, right? The prophecy of Merlin, which also seems to have some familiarity with the 15 signs of judgment tradition, which is, wildly another wildly popular apocryphal text that is what it sounds like. These are the 15 signs, according to Jerome, who is absolutely not Jerome. Um, these are the 15 signs that you should watch out for when you know that the Antichrist is about to come and the day of judgment is going to come, right? And that list is wildly popular. You can imagine, if people are waiting for the end of the world, if they're taught in Sunday school that like we are living in the sixth day, right? The sixth day of the world history week, according to Augustine, starts at the ascension of Christ, right? After Christ goes back up to heaven, we're just sitting here in day six, waiting and waiting and waiting for him to come back and bring the final judgment and get rid of all this crap and make everything better. And that'll be day seven and it'll all be perfect, right? So if you think you're sitting at the very, very end of history, then you're always going to be looking for the signs of judgment because you're like, any day now, right? And so, yeah, that sort of preoccupation seems to be behind texts like that in Old Norse. If Völuspá is genuinely pre-conversion, and if it represents like the kind of Christianity that a scald might hear a missionary preaching, and I think that's very possible. Um, I also think that this fixation on that world history trajectory and waiting for doomsday, like that is a classic Old English homiletic formula, right? If you've read like and even two Old English homilies, you will know that they always take a sort of turn at the end where it's turn or burn, right? Um, it's Judgment Day is coming. Jesus is coming back. It's going to be really bad if you're on the wrong side of it. Therefore, embrace him as your Lord. And it's the Old English altar call.
Right. This is all in Wolfston's greatest hits and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, Wolfston, Alfred, even the Blickling homilies, like all of them do this pattern, right? Even Alfred's, I was just reading yesterday, Alfred in the Dumbarton Oaks volume, Alfred's very first homily on the creation of the world is really just this salvation history that we've just been talking about, and it ends, surprise, surprise, with Jesus is coming back. Get your crap together, right? And so you can imagine, like that's the sermon. If that's the sermon that this poet is hearing, and this poet is like, this worldview is kind of rad. I want to map it onto our Norse mythology, right? Where would our gods fit into that scheme, right? Or what would it look like if that scheme were true? I'm not totally sure what's going on in this person's mind, right? Or this tradition, or whatever we're talking about here, right? But somehow it seems like a person or persons tried to use these together. Whether that is, as some scholars have argued, to sort of create a Norse version of, oh, it's nice that these Christians have their scheme of world history. We have one too, right? Like, is it in competition or is it meant to be syncretic and like be like a new thing? Is Christ one among many, right? Is he just another Aesir that's being sort of brought into the pantheon, right? It's hard to tell exactly what the motivation would have been for this sort of move, especially because it's so unprecedented within medieval European literature, right? If other people did it, we don't have any any
Right.
surviving written evidence to show it, right?
Well, and you wonder too how conscious the imitation is, right?
True,
Because, like, I
true.
think about all the crappy sci-fi movies that have been made since 1977, which,
Yeah.
like, even if they're not trying to rip off Star Wars, they rip off Star
Mhm.
Wars.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Like, and
yeah.
if you've heard it enough, if like it's going to creep into the way you tell the story anyway, because it's like, oh yeah, this is how a story, I don't know, this is how a story is framed. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, whether, yeah, you're talking about secondary orality, essentially, right? But primary and secondary orality have that in common of like, if you are steeped in a tradition, when you turn around and go to produce a new, your take on whatever myth, right? Odds are you're going to imitate some of those genre markers Probably unconsciously. I think you're right about that. I don't know if it has to be a deliberate evocation, right? Same deal with Odin hanging himself for 9 days and 9 nights. Is that really meant to be the crucifixion, or is it just a powerful moment when a god sacrifices themselves, and so we're gonna do the same thing, right? Hard to say.
Yeah. It's, were you trying to rip something off when you had someone say, "No, I'm your father," or did you just think it was kind of cool and you decided to work it into your story too, right? Yeah. I mean, like you
Yeah,
can't really answer these questions for sure.
yeah.
But it opens all kinds of questions. And I think that your discussion of Voluspa as a text informed by Christianity in these specific ways is really well done and really interesting.
I think it.
And a really interesting mirror to Niðurstyggðingar saga 200 years later, say.
Yeah, and that's why I picked them, right? Is they sort of are taking the opposite angle on a similar phenomenon, right? They're both doing this, whatever we want to call this syncretic thing, right? Where instead of being exclusivistic and saying it's either Norse heathenism or it's Christianity, right? Both are sort of interested in saying, well, what if it's kind of both somehow, right?
Mm.
Bolasbau is looking at that, I think, from a at least one way to interpret it would be that is a pre-Christian looking at the tradition and trying to make it make sense together, whereas Niðurstigningar saga would be, uh, you know, a Christian looking back and saying, well, what if the Old Norse myths, what if our ancestors in particular were special, right?
Uh-huh.
What if they were to us as the Israelites were to Christians, right? As sort of the typological forebears who paved the way for this church here in, Munkfjara or whatever. Um,
And I think that's a really interesting discussion that you have too, is about this notion of sort of rehabbing the Asir and the heathen ancestors as like okay guys, right? Like, or at least sort of provisionally okay guys. I mean, actually, this
or
kind of
maybe
comes
even
up.
virtuous heathens, right? Which
Mhm.
is like this weird category in medieval literature that happens quite a lot. Trajan gets it ushered into this and Dante, and before that, the idea that God was always trying to reach out to humans. Um, and there are revelations. This is actually a very Tolkienian, if you've read his poem to C.S. Lewis, right? Um, this is sort of what they're talking about with this, what is it, Mythopoeia, the poem?
Mythopoeia or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
poia, I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, yeah, Mythopoeia. But yeah, the idea that God is sort of was all throughout history was always trying to reach out to all the peoples of the world, and some revelations were more intact than others. That some of them are splintered light, if you will. I know I'm reading my Tolkien into actual history, and maybe that's not a great idea, but but the idea that there are partial revelations that were somewhat obscured. Or garbled or whatever. This is a very medieval idea.
Mhm.
Virgil's fourth eclogue gets used as a prophecy for Christ's birth, right? As a way to prove that the Romans, again, going back to the question of like, well, should Rome really be the seat of the church? Some medieval people said, ah, yes, Virgil actually was a prophet, just like Isaiah or whatever, and he prophesied about the coming of Christ. Just read the fourth eclogue and you'll see, right? So did the Sibyls, right? God was trying to prepare the whole world for for his coming into history, right? And so why not the Asir as well? Why not the uh, Norse, wherever they happen to live, forebears? Why couldn't they have a partial prophetic, warning or not warning, but what's a positive word for that?
Premonition, I don't know.
Yeah, premonition, foreshadowing, something like that, right? Why shouldn't they have had a foretaste of this great event too, just like lots of other people around the world did, right?
Hmm. And this actually brings up another really interesting deep cut Old Norse text that you discussed, that weird Thauter. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
I love Thorstein's Þáttrskelks. So it's the tale of Thorstein Shiver, right? The Þáttir are those little short prose narratives that sometimes travel in big collections at the end of um, you know,
Olaf Saga Tryggvasonar and yeah,
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And they're called Thalkner, I believe, because doesn't that mean strand,
yeah.
literally? Yeah, and so the idea is, maybe they were sort of oral storytelling episodes that traveled together, and like if you wanted to make a new saga, you could sort of read a bunch of these and take the tropes and like weave from these strands, weave a new, tapestry, a new story together. But anyway, this particular one is delightful, right? It's one of those Icelanders abroad stories, which seems to be a subgenre within the Þáttir. And we find out how Thorstein Shiver earns his nickname. Um,
Yeah, and it's, I don't know. Maybe I should say if you're grossed out by discussions of outhouses, you should sit this out. But
yeah, this is going to be not safe for work because there's going to be a lot of toilet talk.
yeah, it's surprisingly gross.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. Yeah, do you want me to like walk us through it?
Yeah, might as well, just so we can talk
Okay.
about it a little
Yeah,
more.
I don't know how much time you want to devote to this, but so this is
Wow.
coming at the. I use it to introduce that Old Norse chapter, the fifth chapter of the book, because I think it really epitomizes sort of the cultural logic and anxieties that are at play in so many of these Old Norse texts that think about the pre-Christian and the Christian sometimes side by side, right? So in the story, Thorstein is out east. I guess that probably means Norway, right?
Probably. That's
Yeah.
usually the case.
Yeah, yeah, from an Icelander. Yeah. So anyway, he's out east with the king, and King Olaf's, they're out partying, carousing. And the king says, do what you want. But there's one rule tonight after the party: do not go to the outhouse alone. Right. Um, and so since he's made that rule, of course, an Icelander has to break that rule, right? They all drink, they all go to sleep, but everybody's supposed to have you know, a potty buddy, basically. And Thorstein wakes up in the middle of the night, right? He hears nature's call. And he tries to wake the guy up, but the guy has had even more to drink than he has, and he can't wake him up. So he thinks, you know what? It's fine. No one will know, right? So he slips out, he goes out to the outhouse, and I will say that I spent an embarrassing amount of time researching uh, outhouses from late antiquity to now, as I was reading the story, because what it says is, he goes to the outhouse and it says that there are 11 seats in there. And the more digging I did, apparently like this actually would mean two benches that faced each other, so 22 seats in all
Hmm.
likelihood. Um, because
An
these communal
enormous
bathrooms,
outhouse.
yeah, 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 this is just a thing. Um, so he goes out there and he's by himself, right? And he's sitting apparently in the seat that is closest to the door. And all of a sudden, as he's sitting there trying to do his business, he hears something. He looks all the way down the end of this long hallway, and he sees a demon, a pookie, the text says, climb up out of the furthest toilet seat. And it just kind of plops down on the seat, and they start making small talk as one does, I guess. Although personally, I'm horrified when that happens in real life.
Yes.
Um, and so he's like trying to make small talk with the demon in the toilet, and he just says like, "Hey, you know, who comes there, right? Who are you?" And the demon's like, "It's what does he say? I forgot his actual name. I have the book.
Well, he has a kind of a normal name, right? Like, hold on.
Um, it seems like he's claiming to be an actual warrior who died because
Yeah.
he's a thane of who is it? Oh yeah, he's Thorkel the Thin is what he's called. He's a long dead warrior from the retinue of the semi-mythical ninth century heathen king Harold Wartooth is what he says. That he's just come up out of the latrine, out of the toilet from hell, right? And so Thorstein is trying to figure out, it doesn't say this in the text, but I'm imagining that he is unhappy about a demon, like being alone in the bathroom with a demon, and he's trying to stall, right, pun intended, and trying to like figure out how to get out of the situation. According to folklore, you can't turn your back on a demon, right? Or the demon will just instantly grab you and drag you to hell, right? Through the toilet. And so he has to sort of make up a game or come up with an excuse to like talk. So he asks the demon, "What's it like in hell?" Right? And who all's down there? And the demon just starts casually name dropping a bunch of Old Norse legendary heroes, right? And which is interesting in and of itself, right? The assumption is that these pre-Christian, even the greatest of the pre-Christians, right? Sigurd Fafnisbani and Starkad Gamli, right? Starkad the Old, they're down in hell, right? So being a good heathen was not enough. Being a good hero was not enough to get you out of hell.
And yet, as you point out, the critical thing, who endures the torment best?
That's his follow-up question, right? Who deals with the tortures of hell best, right? And so there's still this heroic preoccupation with like, okay, sure, they're in hell, but like, who's toughest about it, right? Who's the manliest while they're in hell, right? And so the demon dutifully, like, he takes the bait, right? He's like, oh yeah, Sigurd Fafnir deals with it the best, the most bravely, as you might expect. And there's this sort of delightful sense of humor in this tale as well, right? Where the demon always sort of misleadingly describes what he's talking
Yeah.
about. And so at first he says that, let's
Like
see.
flames look at his ankles or something.
Yeah, Thorstein says, "Well, what torture does he endure?" Right? And the demon says, "Oh, he's up to his ankles in flames." And Thorstein's like, "Well, that doesn't sound so bad." And he goes, "Wait, because you don't understand it. He's upside down, right?" um, and then you get the next one where he says, "Well, who endures it the worst?" And he says, "Starkad and Gamli, right, is the one who deals with it worst." And his shrieks are so bad that even it's the worst thing that we demons in hell have ever experienced in hell, right?
Mm.
And so then he asks him, well, what's his torture, right? And he says, well, he kindles an oven. And Thorstein says, well, that doesn't sound so bad. It's like, he himself is the kindling, right? Um, and as they're having this conversation, the demon is scooting 3 seats closer every time they have an exchange, which is bad news for our protagonist, right? And so he says, well, if it's so bad, can you do the scream? Can you do your best Star Color impression? And the demon's like, absolutely, I would love that. And so he lets out a terrible shriek, and Thorstein can barely stand the first shriek, and he's like, "That was it, huh? That was pretty bad." And the demon was like, "Oh no, I was just clearing my throat, basically." He doesn't say exactly that, but he says, "Oh no, no, that was not it at all." And so then he goes, "Okay, well, do the real thing for real." And so the demon does an even louder, more horrifying shriek, and Thorstein actually passes out and then like wakes up on the floor, I guess. And he was like, "That was really terrible." And the demon was like, "Oh no, 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 that was just his quietest scream." Um, Thorstein goes, "Give us the loudest one, right?" And so then the demon does do, and he like wraps his cloak around his head and like covers his ears, trying to get ready for it. And so he's sort of able to survive this one. But the demon shrieks so loud that all of a sudden the text tells us that the church bells ring out, and that sound causes the demon to fall to the floor and then poof, disappear in a puff of smoke. And that's how Thorstein survives his encounter with this, outhouse trip from hell, right? And the implication is he knew that King Olaf, if he heard these demonic screams from far away, that he would ring the church bell to sort of banish the demon, and that would be his only way out without turning his back on the demon. And then he goes back, and then in the morning, King Olaf's in a really bad mood at mass, and Thorstein has to come clean. And in the end, he gets scolded. Oh, it's typical of you Icelanders to not follow directions, right? And he says, "Were you scared?" And Thorstein says, "I felt maybe a shiver." So that's how he gets his nickname, right? He's Thorstein Shiver. And he's given a place of honor and all of that. And it's a happy ending.
It becomes a Hear's mothers and all that.
Yeah.
Like like it's such a short story. Like
Yeah,
actually,
yeah,
like reading it is probably actually shorter than the discussion we just had about it.
yeah. That's probably
But
true.
but it packs such a punch, right?
Hmm.
Like it's so in one way it's so archetypically medieval Christian, and in another way it's so archetypically Icelandic, right?
Yeah, it's wonderful, right? I mean, like, yeah, the idea that this demon crawls like through a physical, literal porthole to hell, right? And crawls up out of the sewer, right? And is it Caroline Larrington who wrote on this? Wait, I want to make sure I get it right.
If you've got the book right there, I don't
I
know.
got the book. Um, there's an article on this that talks. Yeah, it is. Caroline Larrington, Diet, Defecation, and the Devil, Disgust in the Pagan Past, and she's like one of the only people before my book that had talked about this thought at all, right? And I think she rightfully points to like from especially from the Christian angle, this is about disgust, right? This is about a Christian Icelander who is too curious about what's going on down in hell, right? That he literally, to learn about it, he literally has to go to a toilet, right? And sort of inquire of the toilet. Um, and this demon that is presumably covered in feces, right? Because these are not flushing toilets, right? No such thing exists yet. Or post Rome, right? Whatever. He's gonna be gross, right? And so like just the idea symbolically of being interested in the past is disgusting and suspect in and of itself, right? And it's also sort of symbolically taking all of these pre-Christian myths and saying they belong in the toilet, right? In their
Hmm.
filth. They are below you as a Christian, right?
And,
Um,
and yet he's presented as kind of sympathetic, right? Like it's like if these are natural questions that occur to him, and like as if these are natural questions that would occur to an audience member.
yeah, exactly, right? Because he's still an Icelander, right? He's a Christian and an Icelander, and he's out east with the king, right? Doing whatever the king and his retinues do out east, right? Presumably bullying people for silver. But but yeah, he's I think like you say, it's such a perfect fusion of medieval Christianity and medieval Icelandic interests, right? Because of course he wants to know about his ancestors and about these heroes and who endures it most manfully, because those are the things that you want to know when you read a saga, right? Or hear a saga. Um, and
Yeah.
so, and I think it's also a parody too of like the Volaspal type tradition where you consult a dead seeress who will tell you about the underworld, right? And instead he's talking to a toilet, right? Or a toilet demon, which in and of itself is quite funny to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of layers you could dig into here, hopefully.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding. No
Put
pun
gloves
really
on first.
intended. Because like hell is below, so is what you've excavated beneath the outhouse. So yeah, if someone is coming up from hell, be that a vulva or a demon or whatever, then they might come through the outhouse. That's a portal, as it were, right? That's a higher level of down. Um, but I don't know. Like I had read the story before and said kind of like, wow, that's weird.
Right.
But I hadn't thought about it very deeply. But like you really got me thinking about it quite a bit and revisiting it. And I was kind of like weirdly delighted slash mind blown by it because it really is, as you point out, a really fascinating syncretic moment that's not very like you can't imagine an Old English version of that, right?
Oh yeah, no, never. Right. Bede would never.
Yeah, right. Bede would never. Yeah, that's true. But the Iceland of Snorri's days, like, oh yeah, this is the kind of thing people were absolutely talking about and telling jokes about, and yeah, I thought it was amazing. By the way, that word Pookie, someone with
Mhm.
a Celtic background, is that a Celtic word?
No, as far as well, you know what? Um, what I was thinking was in Two Towers, when they're mustering the Rohirrim and they're all, where are they? They're at Dunharrow, right? Getting the armies together so they can ride off to the Pelennor Fields later. There are there's like the haunted mountainside, right? And outside of them, the text says that there are Pukelmen, Pukel, and that was the first time I'd ever seen that word, as a teenager. So I did some digging. And Pukel it's an Old English word. I don't etymologically behind Old English. That's a good question. Is it Common Germanic or is it somehow filtered? Like, is it a loan word? I
I
feel
mean,
like I
it's
should know
not,
that off my
you
head.
don't see it very much in Old Norse. You see it some, but you don't see
Yeah.
it a lot. And just
It also
having,
shows up in Shakespeare, right? I don't have to just reference Tolkien, but it's also Puck, right? The demon.
oh, is that the, oh, okay.
Yeah.
I just thought, I mean, uh, it starts with a P, basically. So I'm like, that already makes it look slightly foreign. Like, is this Welsh or something? I don't know. Just curious if you knew.
But then P in Welsh would go back to a Proto-Celtic k sound, right?
Hmm.
I'm
Well,
definitely not going to make a joke about cucks.
I-
But I have Holthausen. I don't know if your audience cares for
we
me to
don't
dig.
we we don't have to get into the weeds about this. I was
It's fine.
just the word came up and I was like, oh yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because you actually know more about Celtic than I do. Like
I don't
way
think
more.
so, but um, give me 1 second because now I feel like I need to just. Um, would you believe that the AI generated answer was complete horseshit?
No way.
Something
No
about a
way.
Native American bowl, which might
Uh,
actually be true, but completely irrelevant to what we're talking about. Oh yeah, I pulled that from Wiktionary actually, from the
Totally out
top.
of context, as if it didn't understand what you were asking because it doesn't actually think. Wow.
Yep, that's correct, because it doesn't understand anything. Oh, interesting. Okay. Hmm.
This happens to me all the time where I'm like, where's that come from? And all of a sudden I'm going down this huge rabbit hole.
According to Wiktionary, at least, it does come from Proto-Germanic puko, And it just, yeah, it's not a loan word. I didn't think it was.
Okay.
So
Uh,
yeah, it would be a rare P Germanic word.
yeah, I mean they're out there, but
Yeah.
just always sort of get flagged in my head when I see them, you know.
But yeah, I mean, but when you see a word like that, I mean, Pookie presumably is like a really, really deep layer of oral, folkloric, cultural memory, right? It's a native word for a demon. Because sometimes the other Stigninger saga will use the word Diofla, right, which is obviously just borrowed straight from Latin diabolus, right, which is itself a borrowing from Greek diabolos, meaning the devil. So, yeah, so this is, I don't know what to say about the antiquity of the word, why it would be a Pookie instead of a devil, right, is a good question. I think Simonetta Battista would probably be the one to ask. She's written about the vocabulary of like devils and Blaumen and Blaumother and things like that, but I don't remember what the article says about it, to be honest.
That would be an interesting interview too. Nina in the comments says that Nispuk is the North Frisian relative of the Tonta or Nisa. So
Ooh,
sounds like
okay.
it's a Frisian reflex of the word as well.
Awesome. That's so exciting. Yeah, so we've got Frisian, we've got Old English, we've got Old Norse. Wonder if
So
there's any Old Saxon.
that's at least a good amount of North Sea.
Yeah, yeah, and that's probably why they're able to arrive at a Proto-Germanic reconstruction anyway, is that they've got multiple attestations.
Hmm.
Yeah.
We've taken about an hour every time. I want to be sensitive about your time. Would you take a question or two from the audience if anybody's got
Absolutely.
something to throw at you? Would anyone in the audience like to post any comments or remarks, questions in the chat? Also, anything you I mean, we could spend another couple hours talking about just the Old Norse stuff, but w- could you give a pitch for some of the Old English and Welsh and Irish texts that you discuss as well?
Oh Lord. Okay, summarize the rest of the book in
Mhm.
30 seconds.
Yeah, just I'll
Sure.
just hold my
I mean,
breath while
believe
you
it or
do it.
not, like, not that this is the disclaimer for my publisher because this is not a dissertation, right? Because they don't publish dissertations. But the dissertation version of this project was double the length. Um, of this already long book. So I've got like 50 pages per chapter that are on the cutting room floor.
Wow.
Um, yeah. Anyway, so the old Irish chapter is basically thinking about um, well, let's start with the Old Norse one since that's what we've been talking about. In the Old Norse chapter, what I'm really asking is A, why were they allowed to keep so much of their myth? And B, what happens? How do they use Apocrypha to sort of allow them to look at their ancestors as virtuous heathens, right? Um, so each chapter sort of looks at a different preoccupation that I sort of detect after reading a lot of hell texts in these
Mhm.
languages. And I think each region does have different questions because localization is the concept that I talk about in the book of not just translating these texts, but localizing them so that they speak to local cultural concerns, local concerns about identity, about who belongs and who doesn't, that sort of thing. So in the Irish chapter, they're really worried about the question of universalism and does everyone get saved in the end, right? Is hell forever? Or is it more purgative, right? In a pre-purgatory world? Purgatory itself as a concept doesn't really get codified formally until after the 1100s.
Yeah.
Um, but they've got a bunch of texts that are worried about, like Judas tries to escape from hell by. That's why he hangs himself, according to the Irish, is he's in a big hurry to get to hell because he thinks that when he gets there, if he gets there before Jesus liberates everyone, then he's going to get to heaven too, right? And Jesus sort of like it's like a Wile E. Coyote thing, like freezes his soul so that by the time his soul gets to hell, he's the first one trapped in hell forever, right? Um, yeah, it's wild. Um, in Old English, that chapter is thinking about the baffling array of metaphors for hell that the English are using, which I think A speaks to just how much they were thinking about hell, right? Like I really wasn't kidding when I said every homily and even half the poems in the Exeter book that don't seem to be homilies are homiletic, right? And they end with thinking about the final judgment and hell, right? And so I'm thinking about the competing metaphors for hell. There's one particularly baffling poem called The Descent into Hell.
Mhm.
It's in the Exeter book, and it starts in hell, and by the end, it is, because it's describing harrowing of hell. It's an Easter poem. And so by the end, it becomes this like really joyous celebration. And they're talking about baptism and they're talking about the New Jerusalem and they're talking, it's kind of an incoherent poem. And that's actually the first text that I was working on for this whole project, right? Was I read
Mm.
that for an Exeter book class. And I was like, what is going on here, right? We were in hell 1 second ago, and now John the Baptist is like talking about having arms while he was still in his mother's womb. And then we were talking about baptism, and I have no clue what this means. It turns out that they're just taking a bunch of apocryphal images and smushing them together almost to the point where it's hard to understand what's going on. But the fact that hell would be a place for celebration and joy, right? Because affectively, they're inviting you to imagine what it would be like to be one of these people who is lost in sin and darkness and all of a sudden is delivered, right? Like that's what salvation is. That's what Easter is supposed to represent. So that's one of the things that they can do. And then I know we've got a bunch of questions coming in here. What's the one? Oh, Welsh. That chapter is thinking about politics and hell, with the Anglo-Normans sort of asserting dominance and building castles all over the place and making many Welsh people very miserable. There's a whole genre of Welsh bardic courtly poetry by the Coquenvert, the slightly more recent bards is what that term means. Um, and these poems are celebrating kings for conquest, but then that genre gets grafted onto Christ when they ask Christ to conquer their enemies, their worldly enemies, the Anglo-Normans, and deliver them from the hell, right? Of
Mm.
they take this whole harrowing of hell narrative and sort of project it onto their contemporary politics in ways that I find really interesting.
Mm.
So they're sort of reading their own lives as typology, whereas the Norse are reading their ancestors typologically.
Mm. I mean, that's fascinating in of itself, just that capsule of the different obsessions that you're looking at,
Mhm.
right? I mean, needless to say, we know one very well known book about obsessing about hell, Dante's Inferno, but it sounds like, Snorri's Inferno would be a really different thing versus Wolfston's Inferno.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, yeah. I think each region, like each culture, not that they're monolithic, but I think the texts that survive show that there were recurring patterns within certain regions, right? The Irish are the only ones who are asking about universalism. No one else, that's not even on anyone else's radar, right?
Mm.
And I think that's because they have a body of texts, they have origin, they have stuff that other people don't have. And so they're asking questions of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we
There's
go to the questions?
really just one question that's come up over here that I see. Cameron asked if the pagan underworld paralleled Christian hell, did Valhalla parallel heaven in any way? Certainly,
Uh,
Warrior's description.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. If you're a warrior, this definitely sounds like heaven. I don't know a Sunday school reading of Valhalla per se. Um, but I think that, the confusion of with the term Allfather, right? Sometimes Odin in some poems is called the Valfather, and in others he's called the Allfather, right? And I remember, my Old Norse teacher told us that like, well, Valfather is probably the older term, right? That he was the father of the slain, and that he became the Allfather when later Christian poets sort of reinterpret that term because they don't remember what it means anymore.
Or is it even father? Because what if because
Yeah,
it's
it could be
father, right?
war.
What if it's Thoth's the Lord?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be that too. But at any rate, that the question about that prefix, the Val prefix, I don't know if that works with Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, the Hall of Everyone. I will say that mythologically, when we see Eddic poems where let's see, all the warriors go to Valhalla, but Freya gets a crop of them too, right? And hers is more peaceful, her afterlife. Not that we hear much about it, but I think the idea that when you die, there is a positive afterlife that corresponds to who you were in life and that you're sorted into these various chambers, that actually maps perfectly onto the vision of St. Paul. That is what the vision of St. Paul is all about. We haven't really talked about that one in this podcast, but that's the one, that's the real precursor to Dante, right? And it goes all the way back to the late second century. So it's a super early apocryphal text.
So the kind
But
of categorizing of the dead.
yeah, 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 where Paul is taken on a tour of hell and he sees like, the people who are immersed to their it says umbilicus, right? Their belly button, but I think that's supposed to be a polite euphemism for their crotch. Those people are people who sin sexually, right? The people who are suspended from flaming trees by their tongues are people who lied, right? Committed sins with their tongues. And it also shows paradise, and it shows a very stratified, extremely stratified paradise where Christians who did, X and Y are at this low level, but like monastics are much higher, and then perpetual virgins are even higher, right?
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think that idea there's this stratified, codified afterlife that you get sorted into I could see that maybe going back to pre,
That's
yeah.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, Patrick is actually asking if that had any parallel, and I could see that being a parallel, the sorting of the dead. I mean, you don't see a lot of, it's really, really hard to read the text of the Poetic Edda and get a clear picture of this, right? Because all you get is
Totally.
that one stanza in Grimnus Paul where it's like, yeah, and Freya takes half of them. It's like,
What does
okay.
that mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Is that a Marian image, right? Because there is a whole apocryphal tradition where Mary, it actually, it's so funny. There's two different texts where the same motif shows up twice, and I think it's because it was so popular that people couldn't help but plug it into their favorite hell texts, right? But there's this idea that there's Sunday rest for the wicked. And it originally shows up in the vision of St. Paul, but eventually it gets attributed to Mary in some of her Marian texts. But basically, the idea is Paul and or Mary are seeing hell and they're seeing how miserable all these people are, and it makes them very sad. It is harshing their vibe, and they think that nobody wants to watch these people suffer forever. So Christ, if you are as merciful as you say you are, can you please give them some kind of break, right?
Hmm.
Logically, I think, according to the logic of the day, he can't actually let them out of hell because that would be unjust in and of itself, right? He can't reverse his judgment. That would imply that it wasn't just to begin with or something, right? Now, there are older texts that actually do just go full tilt universalism and say, yeah, he does let them all go to heaven eventually, and it's more purgatory than anything. But later on, that's a big no-no. After Augustine really helps clamp down on that. Um, but there's this idea that Christ won't take them out of hell, but every Sunday he will give them one day off of hell. And especially Irish texts love this motif. And when it happens, all the souls in hell basically spend their Sunday worshiping Jesus, thanking him for this day off of misery, which is also, I can't help but feel that that's a little passive aggressive because these
Yeah.
people who screwed up spiritually are forced to go to church forever and ever, and it becomes the best part of their week for all eternity, right?
And they spend that day just saying, oh, thanks. Thanks for the 1 day out of 7.
Yeah. And it's just one day off, but they look forward to it. They cannot wait, right? According to the tradition. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, is there, I think, is the idea that Freya is supposed to get a cut of the damned or of the dead? I mean, does that somehow mirror Mary interceding on behalf of the damned and getting some of them, right? Liberating some of them?
The,
Mm,
the evidence is so thin. I don't know how you could.
exactly. Yeah. It's very conjectural,
Sarah wanted to ask, how do you feel about comparisons between Balder and Jesus?
personally.
Oh, sure.
Um, your own personal Mulder. Uh, I mean,
I love that Depeche Mode song.
Balder doesn't. Hodor actually hates it more.
Probably true.
I mean, I think again, I see why some scholars will look at the myth of Balder and say, we have Balder the Beautiful. To your point, Jackson, we don't actually hear much about Balder in Eddic poetry in general, right? Or even Skaldic. Like I'm always kind of surprised at how big of a deal we make of him. Like if you read a kid's Norse mythology book, right? There
Yeah.
aren't very many, he doesn't have very many moments on stage.
I mean, he at least gets more moments than like Tyr or Frigg, right?
Sure,
I mean, which
sure.
really get blown up in the kids' books. But like, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's Skaldic poetry. It's like, okay, there's a guy named Balder out there. Yeah, to
Yeah.
when you get Baldur's Dreams, you get that 6 to 7 stanzas in Volaspal.
Yeah. I mean, that's a decent amount of airtime in a corpus that doesn't give anyone all that much airtime besides Odin and Thor. But yeah, I mean, like when you get those few moments and he seems to be perfect and beautiful and lovely and everybody loves him, and then you get this one malicious figure that like, well, why would anyone try to kill someone like that, right? It does sort of seem like Satan trying to kill Christ. I don't know, maybe, but it's also, I don't know. I'm hesitant, even though I like tracing these kinds of influences. I'm not the kind of scholar who says that everything has to be influence and borrowing,
Oh,
right?
totally.
I think people are capable of telling stories that do happen to resemble each other. Um,
And
so
and
I'm
I
not.
I think I think you're exactly right. Like, and what's interesting is when you can find those particular motifs where it's like that's not an accident. And one of the best examples of that would be Nithrstigningar saga. It's like there is a clear shot. I mean, not just the fact that we have Midgardsormr, but the, the fishing for him. It's like, man, that is not an accident. It's when you find that
Well,
they're not accidents.
yeah, yeah, and then in that particular case, like I think you could really zoom in on that and do sort of a case study of assessing how do you tell when something is a source or when it's circumstance, right? It just happenstance that it happens to resemble. Like to make Satan into the Midgard serpent for this moment, it literally says he flew to Jerusalem. Does the Midgard serpent fly in any other Old Norse texts that you know of? You're more of an expert than I am, I think.
Uh,
I've never heard of the
kind
Midgard
of you, but
serpent
no.
flying
Nidhogger flies.
at the end of at the the
Yeah,
Himriki. So is that a Christian dragon, right? That where
yeah.
those kinds of dragons do fly, as in Revelation or as in, other traditions derived from it. But it seems to me that it doesn't the mechanics of the dragon don't matter so much as getting the Midgard serpent to Jerusalem so that we can get the fish hook language, right?
Right.
That's the important part. And so that to me, like that is why I would say, oh, this is absolutely textual influence, not just a coincidence, a happy accident, right? Because otherwise, it doesn't really make sense to force it in there.
There's also probably some weird medieval, like, cosmic geography going on there, where if Jerusalem is the exact center of the world and Nithgardsormr is around the outside, he's got a long way to go. So maybe
Yeah,
flying is the only way for him to get there. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. It does remind me of the feather hama that Satan has to put on in Genesis B, where it's like
Oh, that's
he
right.
flies to Eden with this magical cloak. Um,
That's right.
there might even be an analog. I think that word also shows up in the old Sax in the Helion, but I can't. It's been a long time since I've looked at the Helion.
Yeah, me too. I know what you're talking about with that episode in Genesis, though. That's a cool pull.
Yeah, for
Well,
sure.
like I said, I want to be respectful about your time. It's been a really interesting conversation. Uh, I've really appreciated your book. I've really appreciated the points you've made here. Anything you'd like to say in summing up or to encourage readers to check it out?
I mean, I'm thinking if you're still awake after all this,
Everybody's awake.
um, then you'll probably enjoy this book. I will say that I tried to go out of my way to write it as accessibly as possible. I mean, I know it's an academic monograph, and I know it costs like several arms and several legs. And I'm sorry about that. I feel like I have to apologize.
It's
I
not your
hate
fault.
promoting.
Yeah.
It's true. But I mean, I hate like promoting it and like asking people to like even consider spending this much. You could maybe try to wait for the paperback version after 150 copies sell. Um,
Or
that'll,
ILM. Uh,
yeah, yeah, ILL, right, yeah. But anyway, I tried to write it as accessibly as possible, and so hopefully that makes it a lower barrier to entry. Because admittedly, it is a lot of arcane stuff.
well, but you do it's really, really well structured.
Thank you.
And you do a great job of handling, you know, I think exactly the amount of the primary text that the reader needs to see. And if you want more of it, it's fairly easy to find the primary text right on Heimskringla or whatever, even if you just need a quick check of what the primary says. So I've been impressed. Like I said, I haven't finished it, but I've been really impressed with what I've read. So thank you so much for letting me read it.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Because it
Thanks
is
for having me on.
expensive.
It's been a joy to chat with you and with everyone in the chat.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll put this on YouTube and hopefully get the word out a little bit more. And
Absolutely.
hopefully, actually, I'd love to have you back, talk about more similar topics sometime.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I teach Old Norse every other year here and teach Intro to Vikings class. So I'm always thinking about it.
Okay, well, likewise. So
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
let's put our heads together. There may be other topics we could rap about.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, sir, thank you so much for your time. And yeah, to everybody who came, all the best to you and all the best to you.